Philosophy really becomes popular during the late half of the Edo period because there's nothing to do. There's no fighting, so people are just doing their own thing, and they have nothing to do. So philosophy is a way for them to pass their time. Neo-Confucianism is still the dominant philosophy of Japan during the Edo period because of its stress of morality, ethics, social harmony, and accepting one's lot in life, one's social position in life, which, as you know, was something that the Tokugawa shoguns came up with at that time. So for this reason, the Tokugawa shogunate was very, very big on spreading and being a proponent of Neo-Confucianism. Why did they do this? Well, it helps solidify their position as the leaders of the country. Neo-Confucianism stresses morality and ethics and harmony and just accepting what it is. And the Tokugawa say, well, if people are going to follow Neo-Confucianism, then they're going to accept us as we are, right? So they were very, very big on Neo-Confucianism. Also, they encouraged their subjects to comply with whatever they were told, right? If you're living in Tokugawa period Japan, you have to listen to your superiors. And that's exactly what Neo-Confucianism talks about. So, it was a very, very big part of the Tokugawa shogunate. However, many, many philosophers were also opposed to Neo-Confucianism. It was not just blindly accepted by everybody. Nakae Toju and Yamaga Soko, they found a rival form of Neo-Confucianism, which is called the Ancient Studies School. Okay, and they formed this school of thought, this philosophy, the Ancient Studies School, because they criticized Neo-Confucianism as being too morally uptight and idealistic. They said it's not practical. Okay, they say it's too bureaucratic, and they said maybe this works for China. Okay, but it doesn't work for us. It's just too morally restrictive. Okay, and so what did they suggest instead? Nakai and Yamaga said, we don't have a problem with Confucianism, the old form. We don't like the Neo-Confucianism version. We prefer that you go back to our ancient Confucian ideals, right? So that's why it's called the Ancient Studies School, because they want the ancient form of Confucianism that arrived to Japan during the Asuka period. And they believe that the original teachings of Confucius go against Neo-Confucianism. They said Neo-Confucianism is just too idealistic, too morally binding. Regular Confucian thought is a lot more rational and easy to understand for everyday Japanese. Neo-Confucianism teaches you to be enslaved and just accept your lot in life. Even if you are being wronged by the government, you have to accept it. Confucianism says that as long as your government is good to you, you have to accept them. If they're not being good to you, then something's wrong here. So they believe that Confucianism, in its original ancient form, was a lot more harmonious than the Neo-Confucianist philosophy of more recent times. Yamaga, in particular, was also a very big proponent of criticizing the samurai class. Okay? And he was a samurai himself, but he believed that samurai were hypocrites. He said, you believe in Neo-Confucianism, you force the population below you to accept it without questioning your behavior. But while you're doing this and you're talking about morality and being morally upright, you are enjoying the entertainment quarters and going to the geisha houses and the tea rooms and the brothels. What kind of morals do you have now? Okay. And he also believes that the samurai class are like parasites. They said, their whole purpose is for being warriors, but now there's no fighting, there's no war. So what's your purpose? Put yourself to good use, okay? And he believes that the only reason the samurai were going to the entertainment quarters is because they were bored. They have nothing to do. There's no fighting. What are they going to do if they have nothing to do but, there's no fighting. That's their job. What do they have to do but go to the entertainment quarters? So he criticizes them for being at the top of the social strata, but they are basically useless. They have nothing to do except go to these entertainment quarters. Members of this ancient studies school also study Shinto and Buddhism, and which has not really been looked at since the Kamakura period. No new forms of Buddhism have come in. And they believe that, instead of looking at the Edo period as being the greatest time of Japanese history, they say that ancient Japan was greater than the Edo period Japan, and that they looked to Japan's past with pride. Okay, the Neo-Confucian scholars were very pro-China and pro-Tokugawa Japan, and they looked more at the present situation. The ancient study school was looking back. They looked back at Shinto, back at Buddhism, back at the Heian period, and really looked at how great of a nation traditional Japan was. So basically, anti-Neo-Confucianists, like the ancient studies school, they believe that Neo-Confucianism was just too controlling and too binding for Edo period Japanese society. They said this is kind of hypocrisy because you're teaching us all these moral things, but you're not moral yourself. Okay, and they said if you want to bring Japan back to being great, let's go back to the way we were before, like the original Confucianism, and also let's go back to studying Shinto and Buddhism, and let's make this philosophy more rational for everyday Edo period Japanese by going back into those times where things were better. Neo-Confucianists also were attacked from another side. They were attacked from the school of national learning. Okay, and then the most famous philosopher of the national learning school was Motori Norinaga, and he also had some colleagues, Arai Hakuseki and Kamo Mabuchi. These were the founders and members of the school of national learning. Okay, and they also criticized Neo-Confucianism, but for slightly different reasons. Okay, the ancient studies school was criticizing Neo-Confucianism more on a philosophical level, but the members of the National Learning School were criticizing Neo-Confucianism because it came from China. Okay, they said this is a foreign philosophy that does not mesh with the Japanese. Okay, and because they're called the School of National Learning, the key word here is national, these philosophers were very, very strong Japanese nationalists. And they believed that Japan, being a divine nation where the ruler, the emperor, is a descendant of the sun goddess, they said that Japan does not need to go to other countries like China or the West for answers. They need to just look back at our own philosophy developed in Japan because we're a divine race, we're a divine nation. So why do we need to go to these foreign places for inspiration? And the way they would do that, the way they would learn about their past, for example, Motori Norinaga studies traditional Japanese literature, native style Japanese literature, like the Tale of Genji. He actually does a big, big research study on the Tale of Genji. And they analyze the characters in the tale, like Prince Genji, and they try to make it seem like this is a completely uniquely Japanese text. They say, what does Genji or what do characters in other novels have? What traits do they have that make them uniquely Japanese? Right? So they're very, very pro Japanese native learning. The National Learning School also helps revive interest in Shintoism. Okay, and remember, even in the Edo period, the majority of the Japanese are still Shinto and Buddhist. Okay, and they have nothing against Buddhism, even though it also came from a foreign country. They believe that Buddhism has been around long enough in Japan to be uniquely Japanese now. Um, but at the same time, they do encourage scholarship on Shintoism because, and it's true, Shintoism, as you know, had never been studied academically. There's no holy book, there's no texts about it. But members of the National Learning School encouraged philosophers and historians to study about Shintoism and write about the philosophy of the Shinto religion. So, of course, remember the Kojiki, which is an anthology of Shinto mythology. This was studied in great detail by members of the National Learning School because it contained all the information one would need about Shintoism. The National Learning School loves writing about Japanese history, especially ancient Japanese history, and really up until the Edo period. So a lot of what we know about Japanese history comes from the members of this learning school because instead of looking at China or the West, they're looking inwards in Japan, and they're writing about what happened in Japan. And so they wrote things like the History of Great Japan or the Comprehensive Mirror of Our Country. And these were national histories, but they were also pieces of propaganda because they praised the emperors, the imperial family. They talk about Japanese being a divine race and the greatness of Japanese history and so on. So we've never seen this type of nationalistic rhetoric. Probably even Nichiren was not this nationalistic in his outlook until these philosophers. One philosopher of the National Learning School, Hirata Atsutane, he took it one step further. He was a national learning scholar, but he actually talks about Japan being ethnically pure, and this includes the religion of Shinto. And he criticizes other nations like China, like Korea, like the West as being impure. Okay, and that all foreigners were not divine and they were not pure, but the Japanese race was the only race that was pure. Okay, and this type of philosophy really gives birth to Japanese imperialism and nationalism. When we look at World War II and Japan's tragic history during those years, and what happened in China, in Korea, in Asia, with American POWs, etc., a lot of that very strong nationalistic, fascist, militaristic rhetoric comes from philosophers like Hirata in the Edo period, and also, more loosely speaking, from the National Learning School. A lot of the ideas of the Japanese fascist leadership of the 1930s and early 1940s was derived from the National Learning School and the National Learning Scholars. Okay, so this was that when you ask, oh well, Japan, you might say, well, we've Japanese history so far, we haven't really seen a lot of nationalism. Why did World War II happen? Well, where did that thinking come from? It came from this philosophy, from the National Learning School, because they basically sought out the origins, the divine origins of Japan's past. Okay, so that's the National Learning School. The next philosophy is very interesting, and I like to talk about this one. Keep in mind that for the entire Edo period, the Dutch were the only Europeans who were allowed to trade with the Japanese, right? And they were not allowed to leave their enclave of Dejima, which was a man-made island off the coast of Nagasaki. They were not allowed to leave. You had to trade. They could only stay there and trade there. And if you wanted to trade with the Dutch as a Japanese person, you would have to travel all the way to Nagasaki to do it. Okay. The only exception that the Dutch had to leave was once a year. The Tokugawa shogun ordered the Dutch to pay respects to him every year. So they had to leave Dejima and they travel all the way to Edo Castle every year to meet with the Tokugawa shogun. But apart from that, they had to stay on Dejima. Okay. And you can actually still visit Dejima today if you go to Nagasaki. They have remnants of the old houses where the Dutch used to live, and their stores and their storehouses, warehouses, etc. In 1720, one of the great Tokugawa shoguns, Yoshimune, he lifts the ban on books from the Netherlands. Okay, because remember, during national seclusion, any contact with the West, including literature, was banned. Okay, and Yoshimune says, well, since we're allowing the Dutch to be here anyway, let's lift the ban on their books. So he lifts ban on books from the Netherlands, as long as they were not Christian literature. So no Bibles or no Christian works, but any other books are allowed. So books about science, medicine, history, geography from the West through the Netherlands are brought in, and they're translated into Japanese, and people begin to read them. Okay? And this is how the school of Dutch learning, the third philosophy we're going to talk about, was born. Okay? And these philosophers, it's like the opposite of the National Learning School. They are obsessed with the West. Okay? They're extremely curious and fascinated with modern Western medicine and science. Okay? And in 1811, the shogunate actually opens an office of translating foreign books in Edo. Many of these Dutch learning school philosophers had gone to Dejima and visited with the Dutch, learned Dutch, and so they began compiling Dutch-Japanese dictionaries so that they could translate books they were reading from the Netherlands into Japanese, okay, and then maybe, if necessary, from Japanese into Dutch. So you have dictionaries so that you could translate more books from Dutch to Japanese. And so by the 1800s, many Dutch books about Western medicine, science, anatomy, geography, astronomy, history, they're published in Japanese, sold in Japan, and widely read by members of this philosophical school. Okay, and then these scholars, these philosophers, believe that Western medicine was much more effective than the Chinese medicine that had been used in Japan until this point. And for the first time, they're really interested in the anatomy of human anatomy. Okay, what's a surgery, right? Well, the organs. And this is all new to them. And so they were very interested in Western science and medicine. But the Dutch learning school, interestingly enough, they are not interested in any way in Western political, social, or religious ideas. So ideas of the Renaissance, Voltaire, political freedom, etc. These are not really spread at all in Japan. This is mainly due to the shogunate's ban, not only on Christianity, but also on trade with the West and so on. They did not want to dabble. They were not interested in history or religion or political issues. They were solely focused on Western science and medicine. So you might ask, well, why weren't these scholars talking about human rights or democracy or this and that? They weren't interested in it. Okay? They might have been exposed to it, but they were mainly interested in science and medicine and technology, not in political or other types of social issues. The Tokugawa shogunate has a love-and-hate relationship with these three schools, and in fact, in 1790, there is an edict published that officially discourages the study of the three schools of philosophy of the Edo period: the School of Ancient Studies, the School of National Learning, and the School of Dutch Learning. Okay, they're not banned; they just are not supported by the shogun, and this is because the Tokugawa's official policy was what? What is their official philosophy? Neo-Confucianism, and these three schools they are all very different, of course. But what do they have in common? They're all questioning Neo-Confucianism and not really opposing it, but they don't agree with it. And they're kind of keeping it at arm's length, and they're saying, well, what about these alternative ways of thought? Even though all three schools do it differently, they are all unique, and they're all united in their question of whether or not Neo-Confucianism is all true or not. Okay, so that's why the Tokugawa did not like these schools of philosophy, and they didn't want people to study any philosophy that opposes Neo-Confucianism.